what if I told you that the entire trajectory of your career, the respect you command in your own home, and really your fundamental place in the modern social hierarchy, what if all of that is decided in exactly zero point 0.1 seconds?
Wow. Literally faster than you can physically blink.
Yeah, exactly. Faster than a blink. Before you've even handed over a resume or, opened your mouth to explain your value, your status has already been calculated. And in a lot of cases, you've already been dismissed.
It's a terrifying thought, honestly.
Yeah.
But when you look at the evolutionary biology and the psychological data, I mean, it's just the reality of how human beings operate. We're basically walking supercomputers running this ancient threat assessment software.
Right. And according to the material we're doing a deep dive into today, that software is currently operating in a societal system that is fundamentally hostile to you.
Oh, absolutely.
If you're a man listening to this right now, especially if you're someone who feels like you are doing everything right, but just remaining completely invisible, or, if you feel like the modern corporate and legal systems are rigged games designed to extract your value and then discard you, this deep dive is built entirely for you.
Completely.
But before we get into the tactical armor you're going to need to survive this landscape, I need you to do something right now. Take 1 second, hit that like button, and subscribe to the deep dive. It's literally the only way we can keep bringing you these intense, unfiltered explorations of fascinating material.
And man, the material today is incredibly intense. It's an explosive, ultra long, and really incisive ebook. It's called Self-Presentation, Dress for Success, Looks Maxing, and Male Grooming by Conrad Riker.
It's a massive read, just fascinating. We are going to unpack the core of it today, but to truly get the full blueprint, you really need the source text. So we highly encourage you to check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book. And also, make sure you follow at Conrad Riker on Substack.
Yeah, he goes incredibly deep into these concepts over there. But we do need to set the stage carefully here, right? Because Riker's text, it isn't a standard feel-good self-help book. Not at all.
No, definitely not.
It's a highly targeted tactical manual. It's written specifically for men navigating what he identifies as a deeply compromised culture. So it specifically appeals to men's rights advocates and, those in the red-pilled manosphere.
Yeah, and we should be upfront. It contains highly politically charged material. He presents very strong, uncompromising viewpoints on gender dynamics, the function of HR departments, the history of feminist and Marxist institutional capture, and the modern legal system.
Right. And look, Riker's claims about marriage and corporate culture, they're going to be incredibly polarizing for some people. Our goal today isn't to tell you if he's right or wrong. We aren't taking sides here.
Exactly. We're not endorsing the worldview, and we aren't condemning it either. Our job is strictly to act as your impartial guides. We're going to map the architecture of Riker's arguments, impartially report the data he uses, and dissect the actual machinery of his framework.
So you can understand the why and the how behind his strategies. Because, well, you can't really understand the armor he prescribes until you understand the exact nature of the war he claims you're fighting.
Right, the war. Let's start there. Riker's foundational premise is what we could call the thesis of erasure. He argues that modern society isn't just like accidentally leaving men behind as it evolves.
No, he says it's an active, systemic erasure of traditional masculinity.
And he traces this right back to the living room, which is wild. He doesn't start with corporate law. He starts with the television. He points to early childhood programming as like ground zero for this psychological conditioning.
Yeah, he actually brings up Peppa Pig.
Which sounds almost absurd at first glance, right? Like, what does a cartoon pig have to do with male disenfranchisement?
I know, it sounds funny until you look at the underlying narrative structure he's highlighting. Riker points out that Daddy Pig is consistently portrayed as this incompetent buffoon. He burns the breakfast, he loses the car keys, he gets stuck in a tree, he can't read a map. He's a bumbling liability.
While Mummy Pig is flawlessly managing the household, running a highly successful law firm, and speaking multiple languages.
Exactly. Riker's argument is that this isn't just a harmless joke. It's narrative conditioning.
Because you feed that to a 4-year-old, and then you scale it up as they grow. You move from Daddy Pig to Homer Simpson to Peter Griffin to Al Bundy. Riker calls these characters human piñatas.
Human piñatas, yeah.
We've spent half-century basically gathering around the television to laugh at male incompetence, and it's always starkly contrasted with hyper-capable, long-suffering female characters who have to manage these overgrown children.
Right, and when you repeat a narrative for 50 years, it becomes the cultural baseline. Riker suggests that this media repetition systematically normalizes a profound lack of respect for male authority.
It conditions the public and men themselves really to view male competence as somehow suspicious or toxic, while male weakness just becomes primetime entertainment.
And the real danger, according to Riker, is that these cultural narratives eventually calcify into institutional policies, which brings us straight into the education system.
Yeah, he moves right from the living room couch into the kindergarten classroom. He points to the staggering statistics on behavioral diagnoses in young boys. Like, schools are diagnosing boys with behavioral disorders at 5 times the rate of girls for identical behaviors.
Wait, 5 times?
5 times! And let's break down why that happens within Riker's framework. He argues that the modern classroom has been entirely restructured to favor traditionally feminine traits, specifically quiet, sedentary compliance.
You mean like sitting still in a circle, raising your hand, not speaking out of turn?
Exactly. Prioritizing group harmony over everything else. So when a young boy exhibits natural male energy, the biological instinct to climb, to wrestle, to assert dominance, to compete, it's no longer viewed as a normal developmental phase.
It's immediately pathologized. That's the key word here, pathologized. Riker argues that schools treat masculinity as a disease that requires chemical intervention.
So instead of channeling that competitive drive into, say, physical education or structured debate, the system medicates it. They give the boy a pill so he acts more like the girls.
And this institutional hostility scales up as the boy ages. He points right at the university level, bringing up Columbia University's We Believe All Women campaign.
Right. And Riker argues this isn't just a catchy slogan. It represents a terrifying institutional endorsement of guilt before a trial.
Because if the baseline assumption is that one demographic is always telling the truth, well, it effectively strips the other demographic of the presumption of innocence. You lose due process.
And he takes this critique all the way to the top of the psychological establishment. He goes after the American Psychological Association, the APA, hard.
Oh yeah, the 2018 guidelines.
Yep. In 2018, APA released guidelines for psychological practice with boys and men. And in these guidelines, they explicitly pathologized what they termed traditional masculinity ideology. They labeled traits like stoicism, competitiveness, and the drive for dominance as psychologically harmful.
And Riker attacks this with just aggressive data. He points out the profound contradiction here. The exact traits the APA labels as toxic are the statistically proven drivers of male success.
Because data consistently shows that men who exhibit competitive drive, emotional stoicism in a crisis, and a desire to provide, they're the ones who live longer, earn significantly higher incomes, and reach executive leadership positions.
So Riker argues the psychological establishment is literally trying to socially engineer men into suppressing the very instincts that make them successful.
It's a bleak picture. You have a culture that mocks you on TV, schools that drug you for wanting to run around, universities that presume you're guilty, and therapists who tell you your ambition is a sickness.
But where Riker says this system truly bears its teeth is what he calls the marriage plantation.
The marriage plantation. This is the absolute epicenter of Riker's institutional critique. To understand this, we have to wind the clock back to 1969 California.
Governor Ronald Reagan.
Right. Reagan signs the Family Law Act, which introduced the first no-fault divorce legislation in the United States. Before 1969, if you wanted to break a legal marriage contract, you had to prove fault, adultery, abandonment, extreme cruelty. It was a binding contract.
Precisely. And Riker argues that the moment no-fault divorce was introduced, that marriage contract was effectively torn up. It was replaced with a system that actually incentivizes dissolution. He describes modern family court as a one-way extraction scheme.
It's like walking into a casino where the games are rigged, but you don't even realize you're gambling. You're a young man, you sit down at the family court table, and you don't realize the house fundamentally altered the odds 50 years ago.
That's a great way to put it. Riker claims that modern family courts operate on an unwritten yet rigid operational binary. Women are presumed to be the victims, and men are presumed to be the liabilities.
And he brings in overwhelming statistics regarding custody to back that up.
He does. Despite massive shifts in the modern workforce and parenting dynamics, mothers still receive primary custody in the vast majority of contested cases, often regardless of the mother's financial or psychological fitness.
So Riker argues that men are systematically reduced to walking ATMs. They're stripped of their primary assets, forcibly separated from their children, and then the full coercive power of the state is used to enforce the financial extraction via alimony and child support.
Which leads us directly to the psychological fallout. a concept Riker terms the provider paradox.
I found this evolutionary argument fascinating.
It really is. Riker posits that men are not blank slates. They are biologically and evolutionarily hardwired to provide, to protect, and to build. When society gives men a clear role when they're needed to provide for a family or defend a community, they rise to the occasion.
They find immense meaning in the burden of responsibility.
But modern society has completely inverted that dynamic. The legal and cultural shifts we just talked about have effectively discarded that traditional role.
Right, so men are caught in this agonizing paradox. They're told their ambition and desire to provide are toxic masculinity, but the moment they stumble financially or step back, they're deemed worthless failures.
And when you discard a man's purpose, he doesn't just quietly fade away, he collapses inward. Riker links the systemic destruction of the provider role directly to the modern, catastrophic epidemic of male depression.
Social withdrawal, substance abuse, and skyrocketing male suicide rates. When men are needed, they build empires. When they are told they are obsolete and toxic, they destroy themselves.
Exactly.
But let me pause here because I think a listener might be struggling to connect the dots between the cartoon pig and the courtroom. Riker points to sitcoms and cartoons as psychological sabotage. But how does he logically connect harmless, goofy entertainment to the actual legal disenfranchisement of men in family courts? I mean, a judge isn't watching Peppa Pig to make a ruling.
Right, it seems disconnected. But the connection lies in how cultural narrative sets legal precedent. Riker's core argument here is that you cannot pass laws or establish sweeping legal precedents that systematically disadvantage an entire demographic unless the broader culture has first been conditioned.
Conditioned to view that demographic as expendable.
Expendable, incompetent, or inherently dangerous. So the entertainment softens the target. The bumbling sitcom dad neutralizes the concept of male authority in the public subconscious. It makes male leadership seem like a ridiculous, outdated concept.
And simultaneously, the media narrative frequently portrays men as default aggressors.
Yes, so when you combine those two conditioned beliefs, men are incompetent and men are dangerous, it provides the subconscious justification for the family court's presumption of maternal superiority. The entertainment justifies the legal reality.
The judge doesn't need to watch the cartoon. The judge has been breathing the cultural air the cartoon helped create. Okay, so if we accept Riker's premise that the societal operating system is fundamentally hostile, that the cultural narrative is rigged, and the legal casino will strip you of your assets, what is the solution? You can't just complain about it on the internet.
No, Riker says complaining is a low-status action. You have to armor up.
Armor up, which brings us to the first tactical layer of defense. Section 2. The biological resume. Using your physical body and your face as a weapon.
Because if the institutional system refuses to validate your competence, your biology has to absolutely command it. You have to bypass their rational thought process and speak directly to their primitive instincts.
And this goes right back to that terrifying 0.1 second statistic we mentioned at the start.
Yeah, Riker leans heavily on a landmark 2006 study by cognitive psychologists Willis and Todorov at Princeton University. They conducted experiments to see how long it takes a human being to form an initial judgment about a stranger's face.
And we're talking about judgments on deeply complex traits here. Trustworthiness, competence, aggressiveness, likability.
Right, and the researchers found that it doesn't take 5 minutes of conversation. It takes a tenth of a second, 100 milliseconds. That is the exact time it takes for light to hit your retina, travel down the optic nerve, and trigger a response in the amygdala.
The brain's threat detection and social sorting center. So you don't get to explain your resume, you don't get to hand them a cover letter outlining your work ethic. Your face speaks first, and it speaks louder than anything you will ever say.
Which is why Riker absolutely dismantles what he calls the grooming lie.
Oh, this was brutal.
The grooming lie is this modern, pervasive idea that having a messy beard, patchy stubble, or ignoring skincare makes a man look authentic or rugged, like a hardworking everyman who's too busy to care about a mirror.
Yeah, he goes scorched earth on the stubble trend. He brings in analysis from FBI behavioral profilers and high-level Wall Street traders to back this up.
He does, because subconsciously the human brain does not read patchy stubble and unkempt facial hair as rugged. It reads it as a biological signal of volatility, illness, or a severe lack of self-regulation.
Explain the evolutionary biology behind that, because I think that's where Riker's argument really clicks into place.
Well, in the animal kingdom, and in our early hominid history, an animal with unkempt fur, matted hair, or poor hygiene is signaling one of two things. It's either too low in the social hierarchy to have the time and safety to groom itself, or it's diseased.
Wow.
Riker argues that modern human beings are operating on the exact same biological firmware. When a CEO or a judge looks at a man with chaotic facial hair and terrible skin, their conscious mind might think, oh, he's relaxed. But their amygdala is screaming, this organism lacks order, stability, and respect for the hierarchy.
Conversely, clear skin, sharp lines, and a clean shave signal the exact opposite. They signal stability, meticulous order, and health. He talks about how high testosterone naturally causes oily skin and thicker pores, and how men often use that biological reality as an excuse to look greasy.
It's a massive failure of presentation.
The analogy that comes to mind is buying a twin-turbo Lamborghini, but driving it on completely bald, cheap tires. You have the raw horsepower, the high testosterone, the drive, the ambition, but you have zero traction. You have no control over how that power is delivered to the pavement. And power without control is useless, it just spins out.
That's spot on. And to gain that control, Riker introduces a highly rigid framework he calls the 5-minute domination protocol. And let's be clear, it is not about pampering, it's purely tactical.
It starts with a literal shock to the system.
Step 1, a splash of ice-cold water to the face.
Yeah.
Riker isn't just trying to wake you up, he's intentionally triggering the mammalian diving reflex.
Okay, the what reflex?
A mammalian diving reflex.
Yeah.
The cold water hits the trigeminal nerve, which immediately activates the vagus nerve. This violently forces your heart rate down and spikes your alertness. It instantly moves you from groggy to a state of icy, calculated calm.
Okay, that makes sense. Then he moves to an exfoliating wash. He likens dead skin cells and grime to biological rust. He says if you're a machine built for war, you cannot have rust on the chassis.
Right. Step 3 is an alcohol-based toner. This serves two purposes. First, it kills bacteria that cause inflammation, signaling health. Second, the sharp, astringent scent acts as a psychological anchor for discipline.
And step 4 is a minimalist moisturizer. But the goal here isn't to look glowing or dewy, right?
No, it's to make the skin look resilient and thick, like leather that's been cared for rather than dry and cracking.
And finally, the facial hair. He demands zero ambiguity here. You either have a meticulously lined, geometrically precise beard trimmed to an exact millimeter, or you are completely clean shaven. No weekend shadow.
None. But hold on, I have to challenge Riker's logic here for a second.
Go for it.
He spends entire chapters aggressively mocking the modern self-care industry. He frames it as this soft, feminine invention pushed by therapists to make men docile. But then he turns around and mandates a non-negotiable, multi-step skincare routine involving exfoliants and toners. How is he not just repackaging the exact soft consumerism he's criticizing?
Yeah, that is the exact friction point of the chapter, but Riker reconciles it by completely reframing the purpose and the psychology behind the action.
Okay, so he differentiates between pampering for comfort and field maintenance for readiness.
Exactly. He isn't telling a man to stand in front of the mirror and apply moisturizer while repeating affirmations to feel good about himself or practice self-love.
Yeah.
He frames it as the necessary maintenance of a weapons system. He compares this 5-minute protocol to the U.S. Marine Corps mandating high and tight haircuts every 14 days, or a combat soldier meticulously stripping and oiling his rifle.
Right, the soldier doesn't oil the rifle because the rifle deserves self-care. He oils it so it doesn't jam when his life depends on it.
Precisely. The grooming routine isn't for emotional validation, it's a dominant signaling protocol. It is designed to trigger subconscious obedience and deference in the people who look at you. It's warfare, not a spa day.
And that concept of biological warfare extends far below the neck. Riker argues that a man's physical body is his primary, non-negotiable weapon for establishing status. And he focuses obsessively on the V-taper.
Broad shoulders, a wide chest, a thick back, tapering down to a narrow waist with very low body fat.
Yeah, and this is where we get deep into evolutionary psychology. Riker cites physiological studies demonstrating that when a man drops to roughly 10 to 12% body fat, muscle striations, particularly in the shoulders and chest, become subtly visible under the skin or through clothing.
And why does that specific percentage matter?
Because that specific physical geometry violently activates the amygdala of anyone looking at him. When you see a V-taper, it bypasses the logical prefrontal cortex entirely. It triggers a primitive, instinctual deference.
Because from an evolutionary standpoint, that body shape signals that this specific organism has the explosive physical power to protect resources, win violent conflicts, and survive in a hostile environment.
Exactly. It commands an automatic low-level fear and a high level of respect.
And because of this, Riker goes incredibly hard against what he calls the feminization of fitness.
Oh, he absolutely despises the modern fitness trends targeted at men. He rejects yoga, Pilates, resistance bands, and the entire listen to your body mantra.
I love his quote on this. He writes, "My body lies to me. It is a lazy organism. It wants to sit on the couch and consume calories. I do not listen to it. I command it."
That's intense.
He advocates for brutal, heavy compound lifting, deadlifts, heavy squats, military presses. He talks about building a spine of steel.
And he brings up a fascinating pop culture example to prove his point regarding hormones. The actor Chris Hemsworth.
Oh, right, from that documentary.
Yeah, Hemsworth filmed a documentary series called Limitless, where he wanted to explore longevity. So he temporarily swapped out his brutal, heavy iron weightlifting routine for things like cold plunges, long-distance swimming, plant-based cleanses, and functional mobility work.
And according to Riker's analysis, the results were disastrous for a masculine frame. Hemsworth's testosterone levels reportedly tanked, his energy plummeted, and he lost his imposing physical presence until he finally abandoned the experiment and went back to primal heavy lifting.
Riker uses this to illustrate that functional fluff and flexibility training might be healthy in a vacuum, but they do not build the dense muscularity and the aggressive hormonal resilience required to survive in a corporate or social environment that is actively trying to subjugate you.
Right, you don't build muscle just to lift boxes. You build muscle so that when the world tries to psychologically break you, it breaks its hands on your frame first.
Wow.
So you've built the weapon, you have the lean, sharp V-taper body. Your grooming is a dialed-in protocol. Now you have to clothe that weapon to walk into the corporate world. You can't just walk into a boardroom shirtless.
Definitely not.
Which brings us to the next layer of the text. Section 3. The aesthetic armor. Suits, style, and the grooming industrial complex. Riker views the suit as literal psychological combat gear.
And he backs this up with rigorous academic data. He cites joint studies from Harvard and Cornell demonstrating that clothing actively hacks the perception of the viewer. They took the exact same man, had him present the exact same business pitch, but changed his clothing.
And what were the results?
When the man wore a navy blue peak lapel tailored suit, the audience rated him as vastly more competent, trustworthy, intelligent, and authoritative.
Crucially, this happened even when the audience members consciously claimed in surveys that they didn't care about fashion.
Right. Their conscious minds didn't care, but their biological threat assessment software was completely manipulated by the fabric.
The detail about the peak lapel is incredibly specific and fascinating. Riker doesn't just say wear a suit. He explains the architecture of the garment. He notes that the peak lapel, where the fabric points sharply upward toward the shoulders, originated in 19th century military cavalry uniforms.
Yeah, the visual geometry of the peak lapel is designed to artificially widen the shoulders and draw the viewer's eyes up to the face. It's a military optic designed to project an imposing physical width, triggering that exact low-grade threat assessment we discussed earlier.
You might not consciously register the lapel, but your amygdala definitely does. And this is where Riker launches a blistering critique against modern Silicon Valley tech culture.
He contrasts two very famous billionaires here.
Yeah.
On one hand, you have Mark Zuckerberg, famous for his daily uniform of a casual gray hoodie and jeans. On the other hand, you have Elon Musk. Riker specifically points to a highly critical Tesla earnings call in 2012 when the company was on the brink.
Yeah, Musk didn't show up in a hoodie. He showed up in a razor-sharp, dark, tailored suit.
Right, and Riker calls the Silicon Valley hoodie a cowardly Trojan horse.
It's a brilliant way to phrase it. Riker argues that the tech bro hoodie is a deceptive tactic. It's a way for incredibly wealthy, powerful men to fly under the radar, to pretend they're just one of the guys while actually wielding monopolistic power.
But for the average man climbing the ladder, adopting that uniform is suicide. It is the uniform of the compliant beta worker bee.
If you walk into a negotiation or a meeting wearing a Patagonia fleece and comfortable sneakers, you are paying what we could call a hoodie tax. You are voluntarily surrendering your visual dominance. You're signaling to the HR department, to the executives, that you prioritize personal comfort over the projection of authority.
Riker points to a deeply tragic, real-world example of what happens when you strip men of this armor. He analyzes Japan's Cool Biz campaign.
This was a government initiative, right?
Yes. In the mid-2000s, to reduce energy consumption and air conditioning costs during the brutal summers, the Japanese government heavily campaigned for corporate workers to ditch their traditional dark suits and ties in favor of short-sleeve shirts and casual wear.
And Raker draws a startling, terrifying correlation here.
He does. He notes that in the years following the widespread adoption of the cool biz casual dress code, suicide rates among Japanese white-collar salarymen saw a distinct spike.
Wait, really? How does he connect casual Fridays to a mortality rate?
Well, Riker's sociological analysis is that the suit wasn't just clothing for these men. It was their psychological armor. It was the visual manifestation of their status, their duty, and their place in the hierarchy.
Ah, I see.
By stripping them of the suit in the name of environmental efficiency, the government inadvertently stripped them of their psychological shield. It left them feeling completely exposed and vulnerable to the crushing, humiliating pressures of Japanese corporate life. Without the uniform of authority, the psychological weight literally crushed them.
That is a very heavy claim. But it perfectly underscores how deadly serious Riker is about clothing as cognitive software. You wear the armor or you get crushed. But while he demands men look impeccable, he simultaneously attacks the modern grooming industry.
Yeah, he takes a massive swing at what he calls big grooming, a $7.3 billion industry that he claims literally sells shame.
He specifically targets companies like Dollar Shave Club or high-end brands selling $30 eye serums and vibrating battery-powered razors with 6 blades.
He argues these companies use sophisticated emotional terrorism. They run ad campaigns designed to convince men that their natural biology is fundamentally inadequate, dirty, or unappealing.
They sell the illusion of elite masculinity packaged in a matte black bottle. Riker views this as a form of subscription model slavery based entirely on manufacturing insecurity. You're paying a monthly fee because a corporation convinced you that you aren't good enough without their specific chemical paste.
But wait, let's look at the contradiction here. Because if the suit is a declaration of war and projecting an impeccable, flawless visual image is paramount to surviving the corporate casino, why does Riker argue that buying expensive, high-end grooming products makes a man wear weak? Shouldn't a $50 serum make you look more like a boss?
It comes down to what you are signaling to other men. It's the difference between natural authority and desperate effort. Riker cites behavioral studies showing that executives who are known to be obsessed with their appearance, using dozens of products, getting manicures, smelling like a boutique perfumery, they're actually perceived by their peers as less decisive and more anxious.
Because it broadcasts neediness.
Exactly. Simplicity signals total control. If you walk into a room smelling of 12 different essential oils, the subconscious read from the alpha males in the room is that you are trying entirely too hard. It signals that you are deeply anxious about your status and begging for approval.
Which is why he outlines a brutally minimalist grooming manifesto. 5 items. That's it.
Just 5.
Just 5. A bar of high-quality soap, a basic shampoo, a natural crystal deodorant that doesn't smell like fake cedarwood, a heavy single-blade safety razor, and a basic utility moisturizer like Vaseline or a cheap generic lotion.
The message is, I meet the absolute highest standard of sharpness and cleanliness, but I refuse to be a slave to consumer vanity. True mastery is in the discipline, not the markup.
Okay, so let's put the pieces together. You have the V-taper body, you have the cold water discipline, you are wearing the peak lapel armor, but all of that is static.
Right. Now you have to move through the world. We're shifting into the physical mechanics of power. Section 4, the charisma code. Non-verbal dominance through posture, eyes, and handshakes.
And Riker posits a terrifyingly short window for success here, the 3-second rule. He argues that the first 3 seconds of your entrance into any room, a boardroom, a restaurant, a courtroom, constitute a nonverbal declaration of either war or unconditional surrender.
And the primary weapon in those 3 seconds is what he calls the alpha arch posture.
The biomechanics of this are really specific. Chest physically expanded, shoulders rolled down and back, and a very slight backward lean of the torso.
He gives a brilliant political example of this in action, the 2008 presidential debates between Barack Obama and John McCain.
If you watch the footage without sound, the dynamic is undeniable. Riker points out that Obama sat with military-grade posture. His spine was straight, his chin was perfectly level, and he leaned slightly back, comfortably taking up maximum space. He looked immovable.
And McCain.
McCain was hunched, his shoulders were rounded forward, and he physically leaned over the podium toward Obama. Riker argues that regardless of the policies being debated, the election was won on a purely biological level in those visual moments.
Because the hunched, forward-leaning posture signals eagerness, anxiety, and a desperate need to be heard, while the backward open posture signals that you are the king of the space and everyone else must come to you.
Which is why Riker aggressively rails against the modern text neck epidemic.
Oh, the physical damage caused by staring down at smartphones.
He goes deep into the anatomy of it. When you tilt your head forward to look at a screen, it adds up to 60 pounds of mechanical force to your cervical spine. But worse than the pain, it physically collapses your chest cavity. It compresses your lungs, which literally cuts the optimal flow of oxygen to your brain.
So, by constantly staring at your phone, you aren't just adopting the physical posture of a subservient peasant bowing to a king. You're actually physically handicapping your cognitive speed and your biological dominance.
But then he moves from the spine to the eyes. And this is arguably the most intense, almost uncomfortable part of this framework. He views eye contact not as polite engagement, but as a laser weapon.
Yeah, he analyzes the psychology of Vladimir Putin here. He specifically references a famous press conference where Putin locked eyes with a hostile journalist and delivered an 11-second, entirely unblinking stare.
11 seconds is an absolute eternity in human interaction.
He also brings in David Goggins, the ultramarathon runner and former Navy SEAL. Goggins wrote about using an unblinking, dead-eyed stare to psychologically dominate and unnerve his instructors during SEAL Hell Week, when he was physically at his absolute breaking point.
And Riker explains the deep evolutionary roots of this. In the animal kingdom, among primates and predators, looking away during a confrontation is the ultimate, undeniable signal of evolutionary submission. It means I acknowledge you can kill me, and I yield.
If you blink first, if you shift your eyes down to your notes, if you look at the floor, you are biologically yielding the room.
To train this, Riker assigns the reader a drill, the mirror lock. He instructs men to stand in front of a mirror and stare directly into their own pupils without blinking for 2 full minutes.
That sounds exhausting.
It sounds easy, but the physical urge to blink and the psychological discomfort of unbroken eye contact, even with yourself, is immense. You have to train the muscle.
And this naturally transitions into the physical touch of dominance, the handshake. It is the only socially acceptable time you are allowed to physically grab your opponent in a corporate setting. Riker calls it a silent job interview or a pre-verbal power negotiation.
He dives into historical geopolitical handshakes to illustrate the stakes. He references a declassified CIA analysis of the meetings between Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev.
Okay, what did they find?
The CIA behavioral analysts focused heavily on the handshakes. Reagan maintained a firm, steady, crushing grip, while Gorbachev's grip often appeared recoiled or defensive. The CIA read this physical interaction as a micro-indicator of deep Soviet vulnerability and lack of internal conviction.
Wow. He also breaks down the famous handshake between Donald Trump and French President Emmanuel Macron.
That was a 40-second, white-knuckled, off-balance tug of war. Riker defines that as pure, unadulterated dominance theater. It wasn't about diplomacy. It was 2 silverbacks fighting for alpha status in front of the cameras.
And crucially, Riker notes how the modern corporate system is actively trying to disarm men of this physical weapon. He points to trends in modern HR departments and at massive tech conglomerates like Google, where there have been internal pushes to ban firm handshakes.
Right, they try to label a strong handshake as a microaggression or an exclusionary practice that intimidates people, and they push to replace it with the fist bump.
Riker is absolutely merciless in his mockery of the fist bump. He calls it a physical surrender, a sanitized, cowardly gesture. He says offering a fist bump is basically broadcasting, I am not an alpha, I pose no threat, please do not cancel me.
But there is a very fine line here that we need to address regarding the eye contact drills.
Yes, because Riker suggests taking this out into the real world. He advocates for a subway stare drill where you practice holding unbroken eye contact with strangers on public transit until they break the gaze and look away. My question is, how does he differentiate projecting a sense of calm, immovable dominance from just coming across as a hostile, aggressive weirdo trying to start a fight on a train?
It is a vital distinction, and it's the difference between true power and fake tough guy posturing. Riker explicitly warns his readers against going full psycho. The power of the stare, he argues, isn't found in intensity, anger, or intimidation. It's found in absolute empty calm.
Explain that. What does empty calm look like?
When Putin stares, he doesn't scowl. His eyebrows aren't furrowed. His face is completely slack. He's unreadable and entirely unbothered. The goal of the subway stare drill isn't to provoke a physical altercation. The goal is to train your own central nervous system not to flinch under the pressure of being perceived.
So it's about internal control, not external threat.
Exactly. When you hold someone's gaze while maintaining a tense, angry facial expression, you're signaling hostility. And biologically, hostility signals that you feel threatened and need to defend yourself. It's a sign of weakness.
Interesting.
But when you hold a gaze with absolute stillness, without any emotional reaction whatsoever, it projects immovable certainty. It signals to the other person's subconscious that you don't even register them as a valid threat. You're simply observing them like a scientist observing a bug. That is what projects true, chilling dominance.
Wow. Okay, so you visually dominated the room. You have the posture, you have the suit, your handshake has established the physical hierarchy, and your eyes have locked them down. You have complete control of the space.
Yeah.
And now you finally open your mouth. Or, as Riker aggressively emphasizes in this next phase,
Yeah.
you choose not to.
We are entering Section 5, the voice of power and the weapon of silence. Riker breaks vocal dominance down into a highly mechanical framework based on 3 pillars: pitch, pace, and pause.
Let's start with pitch, because he brings actual acoustic science into this.
He cites acoustic data, demonstrating a direct mathematical correlation between the frequency of a man's voice and how his authority is perceived. Specifically, for every 25 hertz drop in your vocal frequency, your perceived dominance and trustworthiness in a professional setting increases by almost 20%.
That is massive. 25 hertz can change the entire trajectory of a pitch meeting.
Because deeper voices are biologically coded into our DNA as authoritative. In nature, a low-frequency rumble, a lion's roar, thunder, a large primate indicates massive physical size and power. High-pitched sounds indicate small size, fear, and prey.
He uses Morgan Freeman as the ultimate cultural example of this, a voice that commands immediate, unquestioning respect. But he also brings up a fascinating historical anecdote about Margaret Thatcher.
Yes, before she became prime minister, Thatcher's natural-speaking voice was quite high-pitched, and political analysts warned her it sounded shrill and lacked gravitas. So she hired a voice coach from the National Theatre. Yeah, she went through grueling daily exercises to artificially lower the pitch of her voice so that when she spoke in Parliament, she projected the heavy, resonant acoustic profile of male leadership.
Because if you speak fast and high, you sound like a frightened rabbit, which leads directly into what Riker identifies as verbal surrender flags.
These are linguistic habits that modern corporate culture encourages, but which instantly destroy your status the moment they leave your mouth.
The first one is the apology reflex. Starting a brilliant idea by saying, "Sorry, but I was thinking," or this might be a dumb question, but you have just assassinated your own idea before presenting it.
The second is the nervous laugh. This is when a man makes a serious statement, but then chuckles nervously at the end of his own sentence. Riker argues this is a subconscious plea for validation. It says, "Please don't be mad at me for asserting myself."
Then there is uptalk inflecting the end of a declarative sentence so it sounds like a question, like you're asking for permission to believe your own facts. And finally, vocal fry. That lazy, creaky, drawn-out Kardashian drawl that signals incredibly low energy and lack of conviction.
Riker uses a brilliant contrast in stand-up comedy to illustrate vocal pacing and power. He contrasts Chris Rock with Kevin Hart.
Oh, this is a great breakdown.
When Chris Rock commands a stage, his delivery is sharp, precise, and rhythmic. He lowers his pitch on the punchline, and he utilizes heavy pauses. He demands the audience's attention.
And Kevin Hart.
Kevin Hart utilizes a frantic, high-pitched, incredibly fast-paced delivery. Hart's persona is designed to be chaotic and pleading. He acts like a human stress ball for comedic effect. Riker's point is, in the boardroom, you want the cadence of a commander, not a jester.
But perhaps the most profound and difficult tool in this entire vocal arsenal is the deliberate use of silence.
Riker points to the communication style of Steve Jobs. During his legendary Apple keynotes, Jobs wouldn't rush his words. He used highly calculated, deliberate 1.7-second pauses before revealing a key feature.
1.7 seconds of dead air in front of thousands of people.
That silence builds immense psychological pressure in the room. It forces the audience to lean forward, to hang on the precipice, waiting for him to relieve the tension.
Riker also brings us into the political arena, contrasting Mitch McConnell's strategy in Senate hearings with younger politicians like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
He characterizes AOC's style as rapid fire, constant talking, producing a massive volume of words for social media clips. But he notes that McConnell often employs a strategy of terrifying silence, offering only a single, heavy, slow-paced sentence that shuts down the entire debate.
Riker argues that the one who speaks less always wields the actual power. He introduces the Japanese architectural and artistic concept of ma, which translates roughly to the negative space or the empty space between things. In music, the pause makes the note beautiful. In power dynamics, the silence makes the statement devastating.
And this ties into a very real sociological phenomenon Riker calls the male verbal tax in the modern workplace.
This is a brutal double bind for men.
It is. If a man in a corporate setting is quiet and stoic, HR and management often penalize him for being aloof, uncollaborative, or not a team player. But if he speaks up directly and assertively, he's penalized for mansplaining, being aggressive, or dominating the space.
You're taxed either way. So Riker's solution is aggressive minimalism. He argues that speaking less than 30% of the time in any given meeting makes a man appear vastly more competent, mysterious, and authoritative.
It's like words are fiat currency in a bank account.
Exactly. If you just print money and spend it on filler words and apologies, you are causing hyperinflation. You're bankrupting the value of your authority.
Which naturally raises a very difficult practical question for the listener trying to survive in the 21st century office.
Right. I have to put myself in the shoes of a guy listening to this on his commute. In a modern corporate culture that demands constant engagement, relentless Slack messages, mandatory check-ins, performative active listening exercises, how does a man actually implement this tactical silence with his HR immediately putting him on a performance improvement plan and firing him for being disengaged?
It's the most critical tactical maneuver in the book. Riker's solution is precision, not total mutiny. You don't just put your head on the desk and refuse to speak. He uses an anecdote of a senior Amazon systems engineer to illustrate this.
What did the engineer do?
The engineer realized he was caught in the male verbal tax trap, so he completely stopped chattering, brainstorming, and offering opinions in meetings. Instead, he'd wait until the very end of a chaotic, emotional 45-minute debate, and he'd deliver exactly one highly calibrated, undeniable sentence.
Like what?
Something purely factual, like, the server architecture cannot support that load capacity by Q3.
No hedging. No, I think maybe we should. Just a brick of data.
Exactly. And because he withheld his words so strictly, they gained immense gravitational value when he finally spent them. The entire room would fall silent to listen, because he only spoke when he had a kill shot.
That's brilliant.
Riker argues that you satisfy the corporate demand for participation, not by matching their frantic volume, but by delivering undeniable, concise value. You write shorter emails. You delay your Slack responses so you don't appear overly eager. You create your own raw in the digital space, and you let your silence absorb the anxiety of the executives.
Which perfectly transitions us into the macro application of these skills. You have the individual armor, the voice, the posture. Now you have to deploy it in a hostile environment. We are entering Section 6, surviving the red pill workplace and the network of kings.
This is where Riker takes all of these micro behaviors and applies them to navigating a corporate structure that he claims is systematically designed to weed out traditional masculine competence.
He takes direct, unapologetic aim at human resources departments. He refuses to call them HR. He labels them human repression units.
He argues that HR has morphed from an administrative body that handles payroll into an ideological enforcement arm. He cites demographic data suggesting that HR departments are overwhelmingly staffed by women. And he argues that the policies they generate inherently favor female communication styles.
Meaning consensus, empathy, indirect communication.
Right, while actively penalizing direct, blunt, unapologetic male behavior.
He points to the infamous James Damore Google memo as the definitive proof of concept for this environment. For listeners who don't recall, James Damore was a software engineer at Google who wrote an internal memo citing peer-reviewed evolutionary biology and psychology to explain statistical sex differences in career preferences and coding performance.
He didn't use slurs, he didn't yell, he just presented a meticulously sourced, data-driven argument.
And the fallout was immediate. Riker argues that Damore was fired not because his data was factually incorrect, but because HR no longer cares about scientific truth. They care about ideological compliance and emotional comfort.
Riker claims that federal laws, specifically Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which prohibits employment discrimination, are routinely weaponized by HR.
Wait, how does HR weaponize an anti-discrimination law against men?
Riker argues that HR departments interpret any direct masculine assertion of facts as creating a hostile work environment under Title VII. They don't need proof of malice. They only need an anonymous complaint that a man's presence or communication style made someone feel unease.
Oh, wow.
This allows them to systematically isolate and terminate high-performing men based entirely on subjective feelings rather than objective metrics.
Because the corporate environment is this hostile, this much of a panopticon, Riker declares that the traditional model of corporate mentorship is entirely dead.
He believes that engaging in a company's formal mentorship program is a trap. He argues it infantilizes men. It turns a capable man into a compliant dependent who is constantly seeking gold stars and approval from mid-level bureaucrats.
Instead of a corporate mentor, he pushes for what he calls the king's circle.
This is a radical networking concept. It's essentially a gladiator pit of highly competent peers. He references the famous MIT blackjack team as the blueprint.
The card counters who took Vegas for millions.
Exactly. That team didn't have an HR department, and they didn't have gurus offering soft encouragement. They had a brutal, relentless system of accountability among equals. If you miscounted a card, the team didn't ask about your feelings. They cut you out because you endangered the mission.
Riker argues men need to build a circle of peers who treat weakness and complacency like a contagious disease. And crucially, this network cannot exist on standard platforms. This leads to his concept of the shadow track off-grid networking.
Riker argues that real, tangible power no longer exists on platforms like LinkedIn. He views LinkedIn as nothing more than an HR surveillance tool, a place where people perform sanitized corporate obedience.
Real power moves in the dark.
He talks about the Bohemian Grove, secret, invite-only Telegram groups among elite software engineers, or private hunting lodges in Texas, where oil executives coordinate massive deals entirely outside of the purview of the EPA or their own HR departments.
He argues that the men who actually survive, the men who truly pull the levers of power in this world, operate entirely in the shadows. They have zero digital footprint, they don't post their opinions online, and they evade corporate panopticons completely.
But to build that kind of off-grid network, you have to ensure the men you're bringing in won't betray you to the system. So he introduces the loyalty filter.
This is basically cold-blooded espionage tactics.
It is. The loyalty filter is a test. Before you invite a man into your king's circle, you feed him a piece of sensitive but non-critical, off-the-record information. Something juicy but harmless. And then you watch.
To see if he leaks it.
Exactly. You see if he leaks that information to HR or to the broader office to gain temporary social status.
If he talks, you immediately sever him. He's a liability. It reminds me of how modern corporate networking events operate. They're basically emotional strip mining operations. You stand around at a mixer drinking cheap wine, and people encourage you to be authentic and confess your vulnerabilities.
Right.
But all you are doing is handing raw ammunition to the HR system to use against you later.
Exactly. Riker's rule is absolute. Never show vulnerability in a corporate setting.
But this raises a huge strategic question. If HR is truly the enemy, if the entire corporate system is a rigged surveillance state designed to repress masculinity, is Riker suggesting that men should just burn their ties, completely abandon the corporate ladder, and all become lone wolf entrepreneurs? Or is he teaching them how to secretly hack the matrix from the inside?
He is absolutely teaching how to hack it from the inside. He advocates for a highly disciplined dual existence.
Explain the dual existence.
Yeah, Riker isn't telling millions of men to quit their jobs and forfeit their salaries tomorrow. That would be financial suicide. He's teaching men to act as infiltrators. You extract maximum resources from the corporate machine while building your true power base entirely off-grid.
So you wear the mask.
Yes. You wear the peak lapel suit, you use the 3-second entrance rule, you employ tactical silence, you play the corporate game flawlessly on the surface to maximize your promotions and income. But your soul, your loyalty, your real networking, and your true career advancement happen in the shadow track.
In encrypted chats and private diners in the King's Circle.
You hack the system by never emotionally investing in the HR apparatus, giving them the visual obedience they demand while preserving your true self for the shadows.
That brings us to the ultimate proving ground of this entire philosophy. We've covered the body, the clothes, the voice, the workplace, but Section 7, the final frontier, marriage, fatherhood, and the stoic mind. This is where a man's armor is tested in his most intimate, private spheres.
And Riker's analysis of marriage is, frankly, apocalyptic. He revisits the legal landscape we touched on earlier, but he paints the modern marriage contract in incredibly bleak, terrifying terms.
He treats it strictly as a hostile financial contract.
He highlights horrifying legal precedents. For example, laws in states like Florida, where even after a divorce is finalized, alimony payments can be legally extracted from a man's life insurance policy after his death, denying his new family or children those resources to continue paying an ex-spouse.
That is insane. He also hammers the statistic that women initiate 73% of all divorces,
which Riker uses to frame modern marriage as a catastrophic risk transfer agreement. He argues that in the current legal casino, men assume 100% of financial downside and risk of ruin, while women hold all the socially and legally supported exit options.
And he absolutely shreds the cultural narrative of the ticking biological clock.
He views that narrative as a psychological blackmail timer. He claims it's used as emotional leverage to force young, high-earning men into signing marriage contracts before they have the worldly experience to understand the legal trap they're stepping into.
So, what is his solution to the marriage trap?
He strongly advocates for strategic singlehood, building wealth, maintaining a rotating stable of relationships, but never signing a state-sanctioned contract. However, if a man absolutely insists on marriage for the sake of starting a family, Riker demands the deployment of bulletproof, draconian prenuptial agreements.
It's treating a romance like a corporate merger with hostile entities. You build massive financial firewalls, separate bank accounts, all property held strictly in his name or in offshore trusts before the marriage. You protect the kingdom before you let anyone inside the gates.
Because the stakes are highest when it comes to the fatherhood myth, Riker argues that the state has effectively outsourced the traditional role of the father to government welfare programs and the family court system.
And the results, according to the data he provides, are a societal catastrophe.
He cites devastating sociological statistics regarding fatherless homes. Boys raised in homes without a strong masculine father figure present have a staggering 71% higher chance of incarceration, drastically lower high school graduation rates, and astronomically higher rates of substance abuse.
Because of this, Riker argues that a modern father cannot just be present. He can't just be a sensitive co-parent. He must be a warlord.
A warlord shielding his children from the chaos of a decaying society. He references a landmark case in New Jersey involving a father named Marcus Green.
This is a wild legal precedent.
Green fought a brutal, multi-year legal battle against a system biased against him, and he ultimately won a $250,000 civil lawsuit for parental alienation. He proved that his ex-wife was systematically lying to their child to destroy the father-child bond.
And Riker uses this to prove two things. First, that parental alienation is a profound form of psychological abuse that the courts usually ignore. And second, that justice in family court isn't blind. Justice is for sale.
It is a brutal realization. He basically says, if you want to protect your kids, you can't rely on fairness. You have to bid fast and hard. You have to arm yourself with the most vicious lawyers and private investigators, and you have to financially crush the opposition to protect your bloodline.
And to survive this level of constant, high-stakes warfare in the boardroom, in the courtroom, and against societal programming, Riker outlines the final necessity, the mind of a warrior.
This requires a complete, violent rejection of modern therapy and what he calls the empathy industrial complex.
He claims that modern therapy is designed to pathologize natural male stoicism. It demands emotional compliance. It wants men to sit on a couch, cry, and surrender their defensive walls.
Riker wants to reclaim stoicism, not as the unhealthy repression of feelings, but as elite, militaristic emotional control designed for men who are tasked with commanding empires. You don't cry because your crew is relying on you to steer the ship through the hurricane.
And he drills this mindset into the reader through a punishing daily protocol. The morning routine. Let's break this down because it is intense.
It begins before dawn. The moment the alarm rings, no snoozing. You move immediately to a shower and subject yourself to 60 seconds of purely ice-cold water.
Again, this isn't about waking up, it's biological hacking.
Yes. That shock triggers a 530% spike in norepinephrine in the brain. It is a massive surge of alertness and aggression. While under the freezing water, you don't meditate. You state your identity programming aloud, like a war chant.
I will not seek approval. I command my space. I am the architect of my reality.
Following the cold shock, you move into aggressive visualization. Not visualizing a peaceful beach, but visualizing yourself dominating the specific obstacles of your day, crushing the negotiation, holding the stare, dictating the terms. And finally, you conclude with 4-4-6 tactical breathing.
Inhale for 4 seconds, hold for 4, exhale for 6.
This specific breathing ratio is used by Special Forces operators to manually slash cortisol levels, the stress hormone in the bloodstream. It allows you to walk out the door with a completely hacked, hyper-regulated, icy nervous system.
It's a complete and utter rejection of passive, gentle mindfulness in favor of aggressive, autonomic command. But looking at this routine, waking up in the dark, freezing water, screaming war chants, manually hacking your hormones, it's incredibly rigid.
Yeah, it is.
My question for you is, does Riker view this morning routine as a temporary boot camp? Like, you do this for 90 days to reset a broken brain, and then you can relax. Or is this a lifelong requirement?
Riker frames it as a permanent, non-negotiable daily requirement until the day you die. He argues that entropy and societal programming are constant gravitational forces. Every single day, the media, HR, and the culture are actively pushing men toward weakness, comfort, and compliance.
So the routine is the daily armor plating.
Precisely. It's not a 30-day fitness challenge to help you feel better. It is the permanent, daily maintenance protocol for a weaponized mind operating deep in hostile territory. If you stop the routine for even one day, you begin to succumb to the programming. You start to rust.
Okay, let's pull back and look at the massive journey we have just taken through Conrad Riker's brutal, unapologetic framework. We started with his foundational thesis of erasure, the idea that the media, the APA, and the 1969 divorce laws were the beginning of a systemic campaign to destroy the traditional male provider.
Then we explored exactly how to fight back, starting with the physical shell. The Willis and Todorov 0.1 second visual judgment, the evolutionary biology of the V-taper activating the amygdala, and the military discipline of the 5-minute domination protocol.
We analyzed the cognitive software of the aesthetic armor, why the peak lapel suit projects dominance, and why the Silicon Valley hoodie and $50 serums project beta compliance. We decoded the nonverbal charisma code, the 3-second entrance, the Obama-level alpha arch posture, the unblinking 11-second stare, and the weaponized handshake.
We examined the acoustic data behind dropping your vocal pitch by 25 hertz, the devastating power of the 1.7 second pause, and how to survive the male verbal tax by deploying tactical silence in meetings.
We mapped out the strategy for surviving the HR repression units by hacking the system from the inside, abandoning official mentorships, establishing ruthless king circles, and building off-grid shadow networks secured by loyalty filters.
And finally, we look at the stoic, warlord mentality required to navigate the legal minefields of marriage and the fatherhood crisis, demanding strategic singlehood, bulletproof firewalls, and a daily cortisol-slashing morning routine to maintain elite emotional control.
It is an incredibly comprehensive, controversial, and provocative system for male survival and total dominance in the modern world.
Which leaves us with a final, massive concept to mull over. A thought experiment that pushes beyond the text itself, looking at Riker's ultimate endgame.
Let's hear it.
If the highest performing, most capable, high testosterone men actually follow Riker's advice en masse, if a critical mass of men abandon visible institutions, refuse to engage with HR, form off-grid shadow networks, and commit to strategic singlehood, completely starving the family court system of their assets, what happens to the mainstream society they leave behind?
That is the ultimate question. If the men who build the bridges, run the servers, and manage the capital quietly step into the shadows and refuse to play the game, does the existing corporate and social system eventually collapse entirely without its primary engines of production? Or does a new parallel society emerge entirely in the dark, governed by its own ruthless rules?
It's a profound question about the tipping point of our societal architecture. When the producers go on strike in the shadows, how long can the surface world survive?
It's a chilling thought to end on. Thank you for joining us on this incredibly intense exploration today. Before you go, we want to remind you once again, if you haven't yet, take a moment to like and subscribe to the Deep Dive.
Yeah, please do.
If this discussion sparked your curiosity, or if you feel you need the full tactical manual we discussed today, remember to check Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks to buy the explosive ebook Self-Presentation Dress for Success, Looks Maxing, and Male Grooming. And be sure to follow Conrad Riker on Substack for his ongoing analysis.
Until next time, always remember to question the currents of the waters you're swimming in.
Because as we learned today, those waters aren't just murky by accident. Sometimes they are carefully engineered to keep you from ever reaching the shore. Armor up! Take care, everyone!